So I originally made this whole video responding to Josh Noh's original forum posts, but after I made the whole thing, he made another one which added a bit more context and gave us new information. So I'll add in a section to annex what points he's clarified, but also keep in mind that he does state in the newest post that Baptiste and Mei will also be seeing nerfs coming soon to the PTR. Josh clarifies some points that most of the community take issue with, but even with his clarification, most of what I said originally still stands, so we're going to roll the video as it normally was, and then I'll edit in further update his new post at the end of it. News just keeps rolling in for Overwatch this week. Josh Noh, who works on the hero development and balance section of Overwatch, posted onto the forums addressing some balance concerns as well as speaking about the larger power creep non-problem in their eyes. We'll get to that. First up, though, as you guys know, we've been talking about d.va getting outmoded by, let's say, more powerful heroes that sort of have crept into the metagame. You see, the power of other heroes that do the same job as d.va, mostly, have sort of just crept into her space and pushed her out of the way because her power level, being an older, more classic hero, is lower than... Okay, I'm completely trolling this right now. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to behave in this video, but having a little bit of fun. Here's Josh Noh replying about d.va. He says, "We've actually been playtesting a booster's cooldown reduction recently. It sounded kind of intimidating on paper, tested a 3-second cooldown first, but in practice hasn't been that crazy and allows d.va to play the midfield more freely, which works well with her current 10-meter defense matrix range. Some version should make it to the next PTR cycle." Okay, so this is interesting. The developers with Overwatch really don't like to revert things. It almost never happens, which breaks my heart a little bit because in StarCraft, it was just sort of taken as a given that over time, they might have to just revert like a dozen different changes and put things way back to where they were. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't feel like it's an admission of guilt or anything. I don't see why they're so reluctant to just straight up reduce old changes that don't apply anymore, but fine. The devs pick a direction and like to design around that direction. And maybe this is probably the better way to go about things with d.va, because I'm going to attempt to play the Blizzard Whisperer again and try to get into the minds of the developers, having even spoken to Josh Noh. I'll speak about him a bit more in a moment. But if d.va can fly more, but has shorter defense matrix range, that means you as the player can feel less oppressed by her, because rather than defense matrix feeling like it can just swoop in from anywhere and you can barely see it, it's just this super vacuum that has range throughout the whole battlefield, there's more interaction, because if she has to move to close the distance more, there's more things you can do to her to stop defense matrix from happening, right? Just be closer to the battle and put herself at risk, which will allow her to make similar plays that she used to make with defense matrix, but also putting her mech on the line. Now, in my recent video talking about how d.va is dead, possibly the worst hero in Overwatch, honestly, I did suggest that boosters might be a way they would go about buffing it, so I'm not surprised that they did go this way. Again, I like nerfs, not buffs, to be clear, but we're here now, and this is what we have to deal with. So, because thrusters is pretty weak as a movement ability, it being buffed a bit in how frequently you can use it, I don't think matters too much. Because think of it this way, and these are some examples that I wish I included in my previous video on the subject, but back in the day, thrusters was actually a really good knockback tool. d.va could manipulate Rein with thrusters, but now Rein has steadfast, making thrusters just not very good, right? I mean, even Winston used to be able to leap in and land and manipulate Rein. This is why dive comp always dominated Rein back in the day during its era and made Rein unplayable, because not only could dive go at your backline, but 5-second thrusters and 6-second jump pack, not to mention Primal Rage, would just juggle Rein and put him out of position. Now that's not a thing, and there's Orisa, and there's Sigma, who just straight up defends himself. So d.va's ability to manipulate the front line is just gone. Whether they buff this cooldown or not, that's still not going to be a thing. So she'll be able to play the midfield, as Josh Noh calls it, because she can go in and get out more frequently. I mean, that's what Primal Rage does. It's on a 2-second cooldown. If Thrusters was on a 3-second cooldown, it's almost the same thing, right? And that's probably a really fun change, to be honest. Probably gonna feel really good to be able to just zip around like a maniac. And this is probably the better way to go, because if they increase the range of how far she can go or how fast she can go. It just makes thrusters more lethal in a lame way where she just points and clicks, kills things, and like certain characters would just feel unplayable in that way. But doing it more frequently, though, is the type of buff that will get her in the mix of things without damaging the game too badly. And I think as we as a community need to respect this more, that Blizzard most of the time makes these little small quality of life improvements that begin to make a character feel a bit less unhealthy without going too crazy. So while this buff I don't think really does all too much for D.va, but you could look for it to matter more once we see some of the other nerfs that come through, right? Like if Baptiste and Mei, especially Mei, get nerfed, or if Defense Matrix all of a sudden can eat Accretion Rock. I mean, it eats Graviton Surge and all sorts of other crazy abilities. It's not a wacky thing to suggest. If that happens, all of a sudden D.va's like in a very playable state. But I think it's more to do with those nerfs rather than this buff, which is why I would like to see the nerfs first rather than doing them simultaneously or only the buffs. But hey, beggars can't be choosers. So this will be an interesting change, and I wonder what else they have in store on the PTR. If they're working on it now still and adding and implementing things, depending on how much they want to put in, it's either this week or in a couple weeks, I would say. Now, we're going to move on to Josh's second post, which is about power creep. I'm going to have to invoke a trigger warning for both all of the audience listeners at home. What we're going to read out may be hard to hear. If you have any young children in the room who've been victims of power creep, please escort them out of the room. Turn the volume down so they can't be damaged by... Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having too much fun. Let's get into what he actually said about power creep before I go full baby rage all over this forum post. So, dropping by with a fun fact. Looking at GM players for the current patch 1.43, Genji and Soldier 76 are 6 and 7 in terms of win rate for damage heroes out of 16 total. They're not doing quite as poorly as the general community sentiment would imply. Game balance perceptions and opinions are often repeated and perpetuated enough that they start to become accepted as fact by many players. Okay, let me pause you right here. This is the type of wording that kind of infuriates me because it's very similar to the response that Jeff Kaplan gave me at the forum when we were at BlizzCon, and half of the room was asking redundant questions that were answered in the keynote, and I asked a question about the developers' approach to power creep, and Jeff essentially says, a lot of players are dumb, they don't even know how to use the term or know what it is. We don't think it's a problem, get wrecked. And I'm sorry, Jeff, just like Josh Noh, amazing guy, okay? Just want to make that clear. It's just on these specific points where if you only look at their responses to them, it just makes you flabbergasted how these words can come out of these geniuses' mouths. But here's the thing. He's not wrong, but if you only engage with the worst possible arguments, you're just straw manning the opposition. And not only that, I think the stats he's using are bunk, and we'll get into that in a second, but it gets really tiring where the developers choose to target randos on the forums for their opinions about balance, which we know is all over the place, rather than engage with the most hardcore members of the community, whether it be pro players, content creators, people who do Overwatch full time and have a full understanding of the range of the game and do nothing else in their lives but dissect this game. Yes, of course, on the forums, it's going to be all over the place. And as Jeff Kaplan said at BlizzCon, many players just want to see their favorite hero get buffed and don't care about how it affects everybody else. Well, that's not how the content creators feel or speak. So why are we even talking about it in this way? Anyway, so that's to the philosophy of the response. Let's get into the actual stats that he tries to bring up. Genji and Soldier have a higher win rate than you think in GM. Okay, some context. I actually have rated Soldier as quite the underrated hero. So first of all, I'm not even one of these people who perpetuate that Soldier's a complete throw pick. I think Soldier's decent in the playable category if we were to tier the heroes. If the enemy's not playing dive, Soldier acts as a budget Hanzo, which is decent. He's not going to do as much work as Hanzo potentially can, but because shields are so weak, Soldier can get angles and apply pressure damage. He's just not as good as Hanzo, that's it. Dive's not very prevalent, and if the enemy's running static tanks, Soldier can do his playstyle and be fine. So this, like, Soldier's a complete throw pick idea. I don't even know where people are saying this, but a problem when you take GM level gameplay is that there aren't that many GM level players anyway, and you can't just look at stats, you have to look at the culture of the game. In GM, if you pick soldier, the whole team is going to ask you to swap unless your name is Defran, okay? Have you seen Defran play soldier? Defran is the most sensational soldier player I have ever seen in my life. He looks like Simple from CSGO or something. He is remarkable on that hero. Always has been. It's been his best hero, and when Defran is on soldier, it feels like he's got an aimbot. That's how freaking good Defran is. So when we talk about win rates, there is a selection bias going on where some of our most insane players in GM account for far too much of the sample size of that hero's skill set. It's very difficult to make an argument about the health of the game from a subset of the community when you only look down a very slight sliver of the absolute best players in that category. The same thing for Genji. Funny thing, before this news has been dropping the past few days, I've been working on a dive video because I think dive is actually playable, again, similar to soldier, as like an off-meta tier 2 strategy. Okay, if the enemy makes mistakes, I think you can play dive. And I've got a guide video coming out talking about Genji and the dive tanks. It sounds like some hipster band, but I too think Genji's a bit underrated. And because I feel that way about Genji, I think he's in a playable state. I've been looking to make, in about a month or something, however long it takes me, I'll be working on a Genji guide as well from the absolute best Genjis in the world. My pick for it has been Who Are You, who's finally old enough to be in the Overwatch League, who, if you look at this clip, literally 1v3s the backline of the enemy. He just goes in and kills everybody. That's how insane Who Are You is at Genji. But I also think he's the best Genji I've ever seen. If you remember Carpe on Widow in Season 1, where he looked like he could make any fight winnable, that's how I feel about Who Are You on his best heroes. A player at the strength level we've never seen before. So it's not fair to treat those statistics like they're in a vacuum, because it's not like Who Are You always plays Genji. He picks him and demolishes the enemy, and when it stops working, he swaps. That creates another selection bias where win rates are always inflated on situational heroes because your team simply wouldn't let you stay on them without nagging you to swap when they aren't working. That's the way situational heroes have always worked. And here's the thing. I know Blizzard understands these types of stats better than I do. So I don't know why we always get these lame arguments that seem so out of touch. Okay, so we haven't even finished the forum post yet. I felt I had to chop it up this way to keep any grip on what we're even talking about. So back to the forum post. Josh Noh, first 2 points, essentially is trying to conclude that reality is not the same as player perception. I agree with that point, but the evidence he uses, I feel like I've just debunked. Now, the next paragraph. We also should remember that things like win rates and hero power / effectiveness can fluctuate significantly depending on that player's skill. Yeah, I completely agree. But doesn't that invalidate your previous evidence? Okay, fine, moving forward. If someone complains that Reaper is too strong and another says Reaper is too weak, they could both be correct for their current skill level. Also, terrible example, Josh. That's a yikes, okay? Reaper is outrageous any way you slice it. Continuing on, when making balance changes, we typically look at the high-end potential of player skill for a hero, but also try to keep in mind if a given change would be a significant detriment to the overall gameplay experience in lower skill brackets and attempt to find a better solution if so. I think in general, being wary of extreme, quote, power creep is a valid and healthy concern if it's causing gameplay to become too widely distorted from the core experience. I don't feel that we're currently anywhere close to that with the live game. So I want to be very clear about what Josh has said. This is actually the most any dev has yet to admit that power creep is even a thing, because he admits that worrying about power creep is a good thing. You should worry about it. But he sort of pulls the rug out from under it, saying that you should only worry about it if the gameplay becomes too widely distorted from the core experience. So here's the thing. If you translate what he's actually saying, it's that we could have power creep, but it might not be a problem if it doesn't distract from the core experience, right? Which honestly is what I had already assumed was the standpoint from Blizzard by their actions. Because if they did feel power creep was ruining the game, they would mass nerf everything or revert the GOATS buffs. You guys know the song and dance. I feel like an old rock star playing the classics right now. You just skip the whole rant, and you guys have made it for me countless times in comment sections across the world. It very clearly is explaining their actions, where it's more like they're saying if they manage the power creep correctly, it won't ruin the game, which to some degree is probably the opinion you have to have in truth. And there's a lot of confusion about power creep. No matter what, if you add new content to any game, power creep almost has to happen. And since Jeff Kaplan has essentially said a lot of people don't even know what power creep is in responding to my question about it, let's actually look at some definitions of it that are held on Google. Google doesn't know everything, but just read through a few of them. Power creep in collectible games, video games, role-playing games is described as the situation where updates to a game introduce more powerful units or abilities, leaving older ones underpowered. Okay, next one. Power creep, a certain flaw in game balance design where content released later tends to be more powerful as time goes. This can be seen in multiplayer games that have regular expansions or balance patches. Power creep can also refer to the average increase in relative power for all released content in a game. Ding, ding, ding. The changes described by power creep happen slowly and might not be noticed by the players for a while until comparisons are made, hence the creeping. Yes, it's a slow process, right? Like a frog slowly boiling in water. A similar term, mobility creep. I don't know if that necessarily applies to us, but that's probably like more in League of Legends where everything has mobility now. Those balance flaws can be mostly observed because game developers want to create more fun and engaging content, but often power and speed are fun to play with. And one more just to be thorough, power creep is a process that sometimes occurs in games where new content slowly outstrip the power of previous alternatives. It's almost like if a new character comes out and does the job of an old character but better. Remember that Sigma guy? Remember how Orisa could do Reinhardt's job? And those are just the one-to-one examples. If you use the relative power over time, just take any character, basically, in modern day Overwatch, and transport them to launch day Overwatch. Even weak characters now are stronger than they were before. This isn't even debatable. And by the way, I want to make it clear, power creep has to happen unless the new designed elements are bad. Like they would have to make crummy, boring, useless new characters for power creep not to happen. And we kind of saw that when Sombra first came out or when Orisa first came out. And in order for the game to be interesting and change, they have to make new things a bit broken first and then scale it back over time. Okay, that's a better situation than new content being boring when it launches, I guarantee you. Now, all of this would work a lot better if the pro level community could just ban heroes that were introduced a bit too strong, because a lot of the time it affects them the harshest, but we don't have time for reasonable solutions. We have to work within the system we currently have. So all in all, Josh Noh's probably right in the philosophy that you just sort of have to accept power creep's going to happen anyway and just try to make the game as fun as it possibly can be, knowing it's an inevitability. I just wish Blizzard could outwardly say that instead of just sort of kindly imply it, but mostly say, oh no, it's not a thing. As far as the, quote, wildly distorting the core experience, I think that has happened, Josh. Okay, that's the thing. And part of the problem comes in where I think the devs treat every character as someone that should have their time in the sun of being super strong. And that's just wrong, in my opinion. It's just completely wrong. If you designed based on skill and more skillful heroes always scale better through the ranks, the game always functions to a reasonable degree. Now, thankfully, that largely has happened in the Breakable Barriers patch, okay? A big percentage of that finally got taken back, but it's still not 100%. It's not about whether Reaper is OP at one level but not another level. It's about the health of the game. Nobody wants super easy stuff that you just W towards and win. That's what we don't want. Too much of Overwatch is about hero selection because the harsh counters got more and more severe. The gameplay too often doesn't feel like it's about making the bigger play or being able to express yourself, but by exploiting what's more broken. Sometimes, luckily now, more skillful things are a bit more broken, but again, it's not about balance graphs or performance metrics. It is about the core experience, the feel of playing the game. Future Frito coming in at you now. Luckily, Josh Noh does update all of this with a follow-up post, admitting, of course, that you have to consider pick rates up against win rates, and more or less saying that, yes, of course, they don't just balance on stats. They have said this before, so maybe we all should have given them a bit more of the benefit of the doubt when responding, even myself leaving that section in this video, but them saying that they do that gets undermined when you make these niche examples out of things. As he says here, stats don't tell us subjective things like how fun something is, player feedback does. Well, that's where we're at. And he goes on to say that comparing Mei and Soldier, who have, according to him, identical pick and win rates, he found personally interesting and wanted to share it. I don't really want to go bit by bit with all of this because then the video would be another 20 minutes long, which I'm just trying to wrap this thing up. Even this response, which sounds like it's better, still misses massive points, okay? If you have a Soldier on your team, the rest of the team has to prop him up. That's much different than having a Mei on your team, which counters like 10 different things and has an incredible ultimate. Soldier is a liability, Mei makes space, and is easier to play with. Also, Mei and Soldier are both not very popular, and a huge percentage of pick rate comes with popularity. A lot of high-level players are streamers, and I just saw Jake tweet this the other day saying that he's happy to not have to be a pro and care about winning and just play heroes he likes playing, ignoring the meta. This kind of circles all of this, right? Where if streamers are showing off by playing off-meta heroes, but they themselves are insane, that might skew all of these stats, which just misses the point entirely. Hidden inside this post, he does admit that both Mei and Baptiste are going to be seeing some changes. I assumed this means nerfs, but it might be switch-aroos like they tend to do, swapping power from one aspect of the character to another. So it could be either or, I think. All in all, Josh Noh concludes that he wasn't trying to hinge an entire argument based on a single data point, but was just trying to show an example of how these wacky little statistical anomalies occur. But the thing is, Blizzard devs, this gets frustrating because this is the only communication we have with you. So we can't get to that next level discussion beyond just a quirky little one-off quote that you didn't even really intend to mean much of anything. So it's not getting us anywhere, unfortunately. We definitely have to be grateful that they're even talking at all, but just trying to mediate this whole situation, right? Being a community member myself and having the same emotional reaction, like, what are you even trying to say? Well, as it turns out, not a whole lot, actually, and they are addressing some of the key heroes. I just always feel like I want them to do it for the right reasons, right? Otherwise, we just find ourselves in power creep situations where, like a year and a half ago or whenever it was, Mei and Reaper aren't performing enough? Well, let's just buff them until they're better. It's like, well, that's not how it works. Okay, you don't want to buff heroes into contexts that they don't apply. Okay, I'm getting off my soapbox now. This video has been emotionally all over the place. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for me. I'm sure many of you feel the same way. This is an important pivot point in the history of Overwatch, and I just wanted to get the record straight. Finally, the devs are speaking to us again and working on the live version of the game, which makes me very excited and optimistic. And I know it's easy to lose sight of the perspective that I actually think the current balance is pretty fun overall. I just think we need more of the anti-power creep stuff, which nerfing barriers was a huge step in that way. We had barrier creep before, and now barriers are a smaller percentage of the game, and the actual shooter stuff is a bigger percentage. That's all I want. I want more of that kind of stuff, and less of this reluctance from the devs to admit power creep is infecting their game. Because from where I'm sitting, whether they acknowledged it or not, that barrier nerf was one of the best things they've ever done, and it was a huge nerf across the board. More of that, please, okay? It's worked. It's already worked. I don't care about win rates. I don't care about pick rates. Stop bringing them up. I don't care. I don't even care that Arista Sigma are still the best tanks at the top level of play. That actually doesn't matter to me because they're way more fun to play. That's the most important thing. Okay, I'm done. That's it. I'm tapping out. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you actually get notified when our videos go live. Link in the description where we tweet out news, updates, and rants about Overwatch balance. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.